All right. Good morning, Boston. Politics and Grits with Kevin Peterson. It's Thursday. That's Anita Wilson. Love that song. I was telling Reverend Pastor Bruce Wall just some moments ago, this song is so much in my spirit these days. Jesus will respond to the issues in your life, good and bad. Just have faith in the Lord. We're approaching the Christmas season. Well, we're in the Christmas season, but we're approaching Christmas Day, and we're so happy about it. The Advent season, the Advent of Christ, and the reality of Him coming into the world as a Savior, as a response to addressing the needs of a broken world. This is certainly my ministry, proclaiming the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And here this Saturday we're celebrating the birth and all the associated myths and symbols connected with Christmas. Santa Claus. People sometimes like to disclaim the reality of Santa Claus, but Santa Claus comes from the saint in early Christendom, Saint Nicholas. Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas was a real person who, in the name of Jesus, performed some various miracles, and also was known as a secret gift giver. That's where Santa Claus comes from. Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas, a giver of secret gifts. So we don't want to disassociate Santa Claus, the so-called image of the white man and the with the red cheeks and the red hat and the fat belly. We don't necessarily want to disassociate that reality from a Christian saint, Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus. So we're happy around this time to be celebrating the advent of Jesus Christ. This is Politics and Grits on Boston Praise Radio here in the penultimate Thursday. This is a next to the last Thursday, penultimate, next to the last Thursday in the year. And it's been quite a year for us in terms of the work that New Democracy Coalition does. Quite a year in terms of resuming our broadcasts on Boston Praise Radio. We're so happy about it. Despite the ups and downs, we're glad to be here, providing information, providing some points of advocacy around issues related to democracy. This redistricting issue that we encountered this year turned out pretty well. We're going to have the leaders of the redistricting process, Chairman Mike Moran in the House, and then Chairman Will Brownsberger from the Senate side. We're going to have them on beginning of the new year to talk about what the redistricting fight was about. Good things happened for African American communities of color across the state. We're looking forward to having those conversations. Both of them will be the focus of our MLK mountaintop event early next year. We'll give you more updates about that, but that's just one of the really important efforts New Democracy Coalition was involved in this year, notwithstanding our ongoing emphasis around changing the name of Faneuil Hall. Just put out an article on Medium this morning saying that none of the Boston City councilors should agree to be sworn into office this coming January 3rd. That's when their swearing in event is. Usually it is at Faneuil Hall. I wrote a letter to the president of the Boston City Council this week. New Democracy Coalition did, asking them not to hold a ceremony at Faneuil Hall, because Faneuil Hall is associated with Peter Faneuil, who is associated historically with participation in the transatlantic slave trade. He encouraged, through the complicity, quite frankly, of the city fathers or the town fathers at the time in the 1700s. Boston was complicit in the slave trade, was complicit in providing the legal infrastructure, the cultural approval of slavery in the city of Boston, and was complicit in perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade. Boston was. There needs to be some atonement on an officious level in terms of addressing this issue of Faneuil Hall. We've always said that Faneuil Hall is a portal, is a metaphor through which we can genuinely talk about race, racial segregation, structural racism, anti-black racism, however you want to put it. We can talk about those things as we talk about changing the name of Faneuil Hall. So we call for reparations through the vehicle of discussions about changing the name of Faneuil Hall. We're so happy to be pushing the agenda. The Boston NAACP, King Boston, and other groups are making a concerted effort to push the issue of reparations in the city of Boston. We talked about that a little bit last week, where we had one of the national leaders of reparations, Miss Simmons, come on and talk about the movement in Evanston, Illinois. We want to do something similar in Boston about racial reconciliation, which can only eventuate itself through reparations, and particularly apologies. There's a couple things I want to talk to before we get to another national guest this morning. We got Cliff Albright, national co-founder of the Black Voters Matters Fund, the Black Voters Matters Fund, which is doing national work around this issue, around the Freedom to Vote Act of 2021. Senate leadership on the national level have committed to bringing this issue up in terms of passing the Voting Rights Act, the 2021 iteration of it, as soon as they get back after the holidays. We want to continue to be involved in following that and informing our listeners about that. Cliff Albright will be on in a few minutes. I want to just check in on a couple news items that are of interest to should be of interest to any and all of us in terms of race. One that caught my attention, and Pastor Bruce Wall and I were talking about this a little earlier, was this issue around these racist attacks on our newly announced U.S. Attorney Rachel Rollins. They have been pouring into her social media feed, and I believe into her office, and she's requested federal protection because the nature of the communication to her in terms of these racist comments are ones that threaten her life, and so she's asked for federal protection, and it has been denied. So there was a story in the Boston Globe just about 4 or 5 days ago. I encourage people to look at that. I'm just a little astonished that the protection hasn't been offered her. One of the texts she receives talked about a bullet going into her head. Not good news. Not good news in Boston. Not a good look. Rachel Rollins deserves the opportunity to serve the Commonwealth and now the nation in ways that reflects her political perspectives, her ideological perspectives, and if she wants to be so-called soft on crime, that's her right. We should not tolerate her being threatened, her life being threatened. So we hope that local law enforcement will take up the banner, so to speak, and provide protection for this very, very, very important figure in our community, an emerging law enforcement figure across the nation. And let's pray for her that she meets with success as she goes through the confirmation process and the swearing in. I believe it'll be sometime next month. She'll leave office. We'll have another appointed district attorney in Boston. I'm pulling for Michael Flaherty, by the way. Because he's been there in the community and for the community. He's been the president of the Boston City Council. He was just recently reelected to the Boston City Council. And this is the thing I like about Governor Baker appointing Michael Flaherty. Michael Flaherty, if he is appointed to serve as the interim district attorney, it's a twofer. One, he allows the work that Rachel Rollins has been doing to continue in a consistent way. But if Michael Flaherty leaves office, the next person in line is a young African-American man who came in fifth in terms of citywide race, David Halbert. David Halbert. Most of you have heard his name. He's run twice already, and he's come up short both times. But if Michael Flaherty were appointed Suffolk County District Attorney by Governor Baker, it would create a spot and opportunity for a young, bright, fresh voice on the city council, African-American male, to join in the city's ongoing discussions around policymaking, from trash pickup to changing the name of Faneuil Hall. So I'm pulling for Governor Baker, whom I have an association with to help him on his first campaign. So I hope he's listening. I hope he hears what may be of interest for people of color in the city of Boston in terms of this appointment. Also wanted to sort of quickly mention that this blowback around the Omicron issue in Boston is of a racist tone. Also, there's coverage in the Boston Globe about it. Our first person of color to be elected mayor, Michelle Wu, has put up established high standards in terms of protecting the voters and the residents of the city of Boston around Omicron, and is establishing measures that will protect us as best as we know. Well, the pushback from people mainly outside of Boston, so as reported in the Boston Globe, has been of a racist character. Michelle Wu is Taiwanese born, and again, first person of color to be elected in Boston. But on this issue around COVID protection, she's simply trying to do the right thing, but the response from so many people, mostly outside the city, has been racist in nature. That's so unfortunate. Last news item in the Boston Herald today. This is an interesting story. Headline: Hub's lawsuit losses pile up. And this is along the issue of race also. 2 lawsuits settled over the last 10 days or so against the city of Boston. One was regarding the loss of a job by Jose Edwards, a black man at Madison Park Technical High in 2015. He filed a discrimination suit against the city, and they fired him. The school department under Superintendent Chang at the time. That has been settled. The jury has come back almost $1 million in restitution for the city, sort of abusing the rights of free speech, really, of someone who was speaking out around problems around race in the Boston public schools. And then we have another lawsuit settled just a few days ago, $1.7 million in favor of Charles Sherman Neal, who alleged discrimination. He was a teacher. He was on staff of the Boston Community Leadership Academy. It speaks to this larger issue, as we've been talking over the years, about Boston being inhospitable to black people, structurally inhospitable to the needs and concerns, the interests of bringing a level playing field with regard to race in the city. And it's not, I want to get to this issue a little later, maybe the beginning of the year. It's just not a matter of just equity in the city of Boston. It's a matter of repair so that we can get to issues of reconciliation. But there's a difference. And we're going to challenge the leadership in the Boston City Council and the mayor. There's a difference between equity in the city of Boston as we currently know it, and creating a sense of real equality, of addressing past wrongs, of adjusting structural inequality in the city, which has been permanent since the founding of the city in 1619. Even before the founding, we have Africans, 3 black men arriving in East Boston in chains, commencing a legacy within the city of anti-blackness. We've got to address it, and we just can't wash over it by talking about equity and appointing an equity officer or using equity language in order to try to address the issue of long-standing embedded racism in the city of Boston. We're about to talk to Cliff Albright, who's a friend of mine, so known him for a while. I believe he's down in Atlanta, but he is one of the national leaders around the Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act of 2021. It is astounding, listeners, that in 2021, going into 2022, that we are still debating, arguing, having difficulty around addressing the issue of voting rights for all in the city of Boston, but across the nation. 1965, we inaugurated the initial Voting Rights Act, Dr. King, Selma, Edmund Pettus Bridge. We know all about that. We know about how so many people died for the right to vote. We remember John Lewis, who became a mentor of mine in some respects, as I served on the board of the National Voting Rights Museum and Institute in Selma, Alabama. We know about his John Lewis's contributions in terms of the Voting Rights Act, and the nation is at a standstill after or during the Trump administration. We've seen the retrenchment of voting rights across the nation. Over 400 anti or voter suppression bills have been filed across the nation since and during the Trump administration. That's being reported by the Brennan Center in New York City and NYU, I believe. There is an onslaught across the nation, state by state, and legislatures that are being led by Republicans who are filing bills that suppress the right to vote. There is a move afoot, and it's been moving with some slowness because of the difficulty of getting this bill passed. It's such an important bill to pass because it would oversee some of the repressive actions that are being perpetuated and proposed by Republican legislatures across the nation. And so we have Cliff Albright, who's co-founder of the Black Voters Matters group. They've been doing tremendous work, particularly in the South. We recall earlier this year the titanic struggle to elect two liberal, Democratic-leaning senators in Georgia, turning that state in a significant way to reflect the new administration that was coming in under President Obama. Cliff Albright and his colleague Latasha were instrumental in turning out the vote and getting people prepared in their work with Stacey Adams in Georgia. I want to say good morning to Cliff Albright, and I want to talk about the Freedom to Vote Act. Good morning, Cliff. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Kevin. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for getting up so early this morning to listen to our Boston listeners. We're on live drive time, and people are in their cars, people are at their homes. Some of them are on Christmas break already. So glad that you're on. I mentioned to our listeners that we've been friends since the early 2000s as we did work down in Selma, Alabama to get a guy named Joe Smitherman out of office. He had been the mayor of Selma since Bloody Sunday. And I'm so pleased to meet you then, to work with you and others around voting rights in Selma. You're on a national platform now. I'm so glad that you're there. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on the national level in terms of the right to vote and the Freedom to Vote Act? Cliff Albright.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, I think you summed it up pretty well, talking about those Brennan Center numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Over 400 bills that were attempted, 33 that have actually been passed, and that covers 19 states. And some of them are the usual suspects, but include some other states that you don't generally think about when you think about voter suppression. And then on top of that, we've got the gerrymandering piece that's going on, the racial gerrymandering that's taking place. Many of your listeners are probably aware about maps that were being drawn right now as a result of the census, the redistricting going on, and places like Texas have passed maps that have targeted black elected officials and gerrymandered districts to decrease black and brown representation, even though most of the increase in population in these states, particularly Texas, above 95% of the population growth was in black and brown communities. But what we're losing representation in those gerrymandered districts. The good news is, as you've mentioned, that there's a couple of acts including the Freedom to Vote Act, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights
Yes.
Act, which could deal with some of this voter suppression. And we're very close to getting it passed. We could talk more about the obstacles, but basically the current status right now is that the Senate, the House has approved it. The Senate has considered it one time. It got shot down because of the filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, as a result of movement, organizing, protest, and civil disobedience, the Senate has been pushed. Senator Schumer, in particular, has been pushed to reprioritize the Freedom of Vote Act. He says it'll be the first thing they deal with when they come back from this recess, even though we argued they should not have gone on recess because there should be no vacation without representation.
I like that. A take on the old line of no taxation without representation. Oh, let's go back a little bit, Cliff, and please, can you define voter suppression, and what iterations are those acts of voter or laws related to voter suppression that's been, some of which have been institutionalized within, I think you said 19 states, 33 different laws already passed. Can you define what that means for our listeners, please? What's voter suppression?
Yeah, I mean, writ large, it's anything that impedes a community or individual voters' ability to freely exercise their right to vote and their right to be represented, right? And so that's a wide definition. You know, one of the things we talk about at Black Voters Matter is that there's a spectrum of suppression, and that can include the kinds of things like what we saw in Selma, right, where you and I met, you know, as you said, 20 years ago. But, you know, it can include outright trying to block people from registering. It can include all the things that we saw during Jim Crow, the counting of jelly beans and literacy tests, right? That's old school voter suppression. But the more modern forms include closing polling places. We're in a battle right now here in Georgia in one of our counties, Lincoln County, where they're trying to close 6 out of 7 polling places. Wow. Every polling place except one, right? We saw the same thing, and we've seen the same thing in state after state. And it coincidentally, all of this immediately followed the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in 2013, 8 years ago.
The Section 5.
Where they weakened. Exactly. They weakened and took away basically Section 5, which is the pre-clearance provisions, which meant that states and local jurisdictions that previously would have had to pre-clear any changes, whether that's polling places, number of days of early voting, you know, polling place hours, ID requirements, any change, redistricting, any of these changes would have had to have been pre-cleared by the federal government, by the Justice Department. But when the Supreme Court gutted that, it opened up the door to all these changes. So again, it could include polling place closures, hours. It could include registration requirements. It could include restrictions on the types of organizations that even do registration, right? It can impose, you know, it can do things like what we've seen in Texas, where they're criminalizing not just voters but elected officials who send out ballot applications to voters, right? And so there's a whole range. It can include, like in Georgia, where they're criminalizing organizations that give out food and water to voters as they wait online.
They don't want them to get out of line to get some food for the war. So anyone who would come and give a voter who's standing in line to vote a cup of water, that could potentially become a criminal act based on legislation that's being passed in Georgia. Or has it been passed in Georgia?
It's been passed.
It's been passed.
It's been passed.
So Cliff Albright could not go and hand someone a cup of water, an 80-year-old woman who's standing in line to vote. You couldn't give without facing some legal repercussions?
Exactly. Those
suppression.
are the kinds of tactics and again, that impedes people's ability to exercise their right to vote, especially when you consider that the long lines themselves are in place because of
things like things are like like closing polls, right? 7 out of 8 polls.
Exactly.
You create long lines, and then you penalize people for trying to alleviate that situation. Let me get a little bit of pushback, because one of the things that I get back in terms of pushback, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with it, but I oppose the voter ID laws, right? And that's been a sort of a target by the right in terms of voter suppression. That we shouldn't require them as a strict measure of voting on election day. Why should we be opposed to a voter ID law? What's the problem with that, as you see it, Cliff?
All right. So let me answer that in part by just going back a step, if you don't mind.
Sure,
right?
go ahead.
Because I mentioned some of the Jim Crow stuff.
Yes.
And when we make these Jim Crow comparisons, people say, "Oh, you're exaggerating. That's hyperbole. Jim Crow was worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jim Crow was the black-only, white-only water fountain, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of like public accommodations, yes, that's true. But in terms of voting, what did Jim Crow look like, right? There were no laws that said only black people had to take the literacy test. But it was in the implementation that it was targeted at black folks,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
There was no law that said only black folks had to count the jelly beans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or pay the poll tax.
Mm-hmm.
But it was in the implementation that we knew that it was targeted. We knew it was Jim Crow, right? It was targeted at black folks. The same thing applies to some of these laws and policies today, which on the face of it seem like, oh, well, that's kind of reasonable. Why shouldn't somebody have to present ID? And that applies to everybody. What it fails to take into account, and we've seen the impact of these laws, is that it disproportionately impacts black communities,
Mm-hmm.
brown communities, poor communities, even younger voters. In the state of Texas, in Georgia for that matter, it's easier to get a gun ID, than to get a gun than it is to vote, and so.
Yeah.
Or like in Texas, where they'll use a gun permit, but they won't use a student ID for students that are attending university, right? That's intentional, right? And so these voter ID policies, although on the face of it, it may seem harmless, the way that it's implemented, it targets black and brown and marginalized communities, and it has had an impact on turnout in those communities, because not everybody can get ID. It seems simple, right? It only costs sometimes they'll make it free, but and sometimes it might cost $10, $20, or whatever to get one of those state IDs. Either way, you got to travel to go get it. That's not always an easy thing, particularly when you talk about states that have rural communities, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly when Alabama did this, at the same time they passed their photo ID, they also simultaneously closed down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties where most black folks live.
Yeah.
That shows you the intentionality and the connection. They understand that if you can limit where people can get ID, then you can limit their right to vote. So it's not just this generic, harmless thing that some people may think it is on the face of it.
Yeah. I mean, there are policies and laws that are put in place that don't necessarily say black people can't do this or that in terms of voting, but the overall intention and the overall outcome is that there is black suppression. Let me go back a little bit. I know we don't have you for too long, but I was remiss in sort of introducing you. Now, you and Latasha Brown are national leaders on this issue around protecting the vote, the right to vote, mobilizing, galvanizing people to the polls. You had so much success. The New York Times and other places have covered you. You're the national leaders, as I see it. You're also one of our national recipients of the Boston Mountaintop Awards. That's coming up sometime in January. We'll talk about that a little more. But can you just tell us a little bit, Cliff Albright, co-founder of the Black Voters Matters Fund. Could you tell us what your organization does, and why did you feel the need, you and Latasha Brown, to create it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for the kind words. But we are a power building organization. We believe in building power in black communities, and we believe that elections are one way of doing that. Although we are very consistent and insistent that people recognize that it's one way and it's an important way, but it's not the only way. Mm-hmm. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to create an organization. When we would be around Selma doing all that good work and nobody knew about it over 20 something years ago, we'd always say, man, what would we do if we had $1 million that we could just use however we needed to use and give to groups? And so finally, just 4 years ago, because Black Voters Matter is a new organization, even though this work is based on 30 years of experience doing racial justice organizing and electoral organizing, we didn't actually form Black Voters Matter until just 4 years ago. And so 4 years ago was the Doug Jones, Roy Moore, Alabama Senate election.
That's right, yeah.
We said, people called up and said, hey, we're not getting any money on the ground. And we said, what do you mean? I'm watching the news. They're talking about all this money that's flowing into that Senate race. And they're like, no, it's not getting on the ground. It's not getting to our organization. So Tasha and I went and started, doing some fundraising, got $25,000 that folks said, hey, go do something with this. So we said, well, we know 25 groups that are doing excellent work, but they're under-resourced. How about we give them all $1,000? And we did that, and they did incredible work. And then, days later, we were able to raise some more money, and so we gave some more out to these groups. And, and then, the rest is history in terms of Black voters having a higher turnout in terms of percentage of the electorate in that Senate race than they had in the presidential race, right? That's how impactful these groups are. So that's what we try to do. We believe that if we get money into the hands, not just money, but other resources, into the hands of local groups who have authentic relations and do this work 365 days out of the year, not just election time, but all throughout the year, dealing with racial justice organizing issues. If we get them the resources they need, whether that's money, whether that's tools and technology like texting tools, whether that's training on GOTV strategies or communications, or whether that's connections, right, with other groups, with statewide groups, with national groups, with local media, local and national media, connectivity is a big part of what we bring to the table. That's one of our biggest offerings. And then another offering is just strategy. Like sometimes, if we do nothing else other than we go to communities where folks are doing good work, and they just want to know, that what they're dreaming and scheming isn't crazy, then we're able to connect with them and let them know, no, you're not crazy. And guess what? Here's some strategy that we've done that might be useful for you in this situation. If we don't do anything else but that, and letting people know in communities that have never been touched that they matter, that they are loved, and that they have power. If all we do is communicate that to a group of individuals, activists, or organizations in a community, then we've done our job, right? So those are all the things that we do. And again, we don't do that just about elections. We do that on issues like police violence, like gentrification, like environmental justice organizing. You name the issue that
you become a full-fledged advocacy group. We were just in Washington, D.C., just to go back to the Freedom to Vote Act, just a few weeks ago, being arrested together. I was glad to stand with you. So you do marvelous work around advocacy. This is Politics and Grits with Kevin Peterson, Boston Praise Radio. We're on every Thursday, 8 a.m. to 9. We're talking with Cliff Albright, one of the national leaders around voter advocacy. He and LaTasha Brown, both good friends, have initiated a powerful, nationally focused organization that addresses the issue around voting, but extended issues as it relates to advocacy in terms of the environment and the other things that Cliff has just mentioned. We only have a few more minutes with Cliff, but here's the important question that we like to ask our guests when they come on this show, Cliff. It's called Politics and Grits. So the question is, A, do you eat grits, and what do you put on your grits, man?
Well, I live in Atlanta, Georgia. Prior to being here, I lived in Selma, Alabama, as you know, for 10 years, right, which is in the deep South, the rural Black Belt of Alabama. And so, the question of whether or not I eat grits kind of answers itself.
We don't have to ask, right?
But I'll let people know, even though I'm born and raised in the Bronx, right? My mom was born in Alabama. My dad was born in Georgia, And so, I'm not new to grits. I didn't just discover grits when I moved down to Selma in 1998. I grew up on it. Although my wife, these Southerners, they get kind of snooty about their grits. They think that nobody else can do it like that.
What's your preference? What's your add-on in terms of grits? Is it just, are you a traditionalist? Just put some butter on it, or do you put hot sauce? Do you put cheese on it? Black people have managed with their imagination to include all kinds of concoctions with their grits. I had someone put syrup. Said they put syrup, Aunt Jemima's syrup, in their grits. Or are you just straight up nothing on it? I'll take it plain. How do you?
Yeah, I'm just a traditional, little salt, little butter, although I will say this, every now and then you run across folks that'll. To some people, this will sound like blasphemy, but some people that put a little sugar in it.
Yeah. And, that makes it cream of wheat for me, pretty much. But we use. I'm joking a little bit, but we use grits as kind of like a metaphor in this show, because it's about grit. It's about grittiness, and it's about the black community, and grits is just a staple to black communities across the country, particularly in the South. And it has been something that fed us and provided the substance for us to move on to do the work that we do. So we use it as a metaphor. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Let me say this real quick, because what you're touching on is, it's a metaphor, but the fact is, it's an important part of organizing.
Yes, grit.
Right. That's right. Grit, or more broadly, food and culture in our organizing. And you'd be surprised how many groups we come across, or funding groups, right, who are like, oh, why do y'all do so much with food? Yeah. And we say because it's necessary for our organizing, right? Because people show up. Sometimes people, they're coming straight from work. You're trying to do a community meeting, and it's right after work, or they're bringing their kids after school, but you don't provide food. That makes that not be a feasible activity for people to participate in. But, beyond that, it's just the part about, breaking bread, right, and coming together and sharing as we talk, and so in a lot of our events, we use food, we use other aspects of our culture to do the organizing, and we encourage our local partners to do the same, because sometimes they're surprised that we encourage them to do so, because they're used to, either not having resources to do food, or people even telling them, I'm going to give you this donation, but you can't use it for food. You can only use it for X, Y, Z. Right. And so we say, feel free to use our support on anything that pulls our culture in, whether that's food, whether that's our music, whether that's a little dance, whether that's some faith. So this notion you have of politics and grits is really important. It's a way to go about doing the organizing that's been incredibly effective for decades. Yeah,
so we try to. I cannot imagine. Let's go back to slavery days. I can't imagine a group of enslaved black people, say in the South, in one of those counties in Georgia, not sitting around the table and not discussing their freedom around food.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
I cannot imagine that the subject of emancipation, the first abolitionists were black people, by the way. I can't imagine them not being around, eating whatever staples that they were allowed for food after slaving in the field or in the big house. Them not eating some cornbread or having some grits and thinking or having their mind on freedom, the right to vote. The right to build, right to build churches independently. The right to organize their university. The two most important things that slaves or formerly enslaved people did upon emancipation was build schools and churches. I can't imagine those conversations, that kind of strategic organizing among black people during that dark period of our nation's history, not being accompanied with some kind of foods, especially something like grits. Cliff, we're sort of running out of time, but I want to go back to our initial sort of subject. What can we do in Boston? You got people listening. We decided not to take any calls, but our Facebook pages, our social media stuff is humming. What can we in Boston, what can people in general, because this will go across the nation, what can people do in general as we come over the Christmas holiday break? The Senate resumes. Chuck Schumer, the Senate president, the Senate leader, has said that he would reinitiate this discussion around the Freedom to Vote Act. What can we do to impress our nation's lawmakers around the imperative nature of passing this legislation?
Great question. The first thing that people can do, and we can do it right now, even over the holiday break, because although they're taking vacation, we're not, right? So we've still got people all around the country that are phone banking, making phone calls to the White House in particular, to put some pressure on the president to lean into this issue, because he has not leaned in enough. He's not gone to Congress to meet with them the way that he did for the infrastructure bill. He's not done that for voting rights. And so, we're doing phone calls to the White House. We're also doing phone calls to the Senate. You can call yes senators, or you can call Chuck Schumer, right? But we've got phone lines that are set up to reach them. You can get more information by following us on our social media. That's Black Voters MTR on Facebook, Twitter, and IG. Black Voters MTR. You can also text us, and I apologize, I'm going to give our texting code, but it's actually in the process of switching over to a new number. But I think if people use it between now and January 1st, this will still work. You can text us, We Matter to 797979. Again, that's We Matter to 797979, and that'll get you on our list. Also get you a response back that'll give you some information about how to connect with us, and also follow some of our partners, right, who are doing these phone banks. Legal Women's Voters, right? Follow them on Twitter, because they've got some information posted around the phone banking that they're doing. The DFAD Coalition, that's Declaration for American Democracy. They've got some phone banks going on as well. And so, follow these groups, get connected to somebody, get connected to Kevin and his group if you're in the Boston area, but get connected to an organization that is doing this work on a regular basis. There's a role for everybody to play in this work.
There's a role for everyone. We're all, as citizens, sort of connected through the right to vote, through the right to participate in our democracy. There is no distinction between a disadvantaged or a disenfranchised voter in Massachusetts and one who is disenfranchised in Georgia or any other place. We're all connected. I want to. Okay, go ahead. Sure.
I'm sorry. Last thing, real quick.
Yes.
That point you made is just so important. And a lot of times, folks in the North or in blue states, that kind of progressive. They think, oh, well, this voter suppression issue doesn't impact me. Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I've done an amendment or a corollary. Voter suppression anywhere is a threat to our voting rights everywhere. And so what happens with voter suppression, and think about if we had not been able to overcome the voter suppression in Georgia. You mentioned that Georgia Senate race, right?
Yeah.
We didn't win those 2 Senate seats because there was no voter suppression. We were able to overcome that voter suppression, and not something that we'll be able to do after this new law, though, because we can't out-organize this level of suppression. But we were able to do that. But if we had not done that, guess what? Not having those 2 Senate seats would have impacted everything we've seen over the past year, from COVID to American Rescue Plan to everything that we've seen. And so what happens in Georgia or what happens in Texas or what happens in Florida impacts everybody in Massachusetts and New York and California. Everywhere, we're all connected, as you said.
And we were organizing phone banks around the Georgia race earlier this year. And you're absolutely right, Cliff. We wouldn't have this first infrastructure bill had we not had those senators in, and we wouldn't have the opportunity where we are now in terms of passing this voting right. It's just astounding, really, to think that 2 generations after Dr. King and others marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you and I have done it together, that we still have this issue around voter suppression. It's just astounding in 2022 as we arrive to that year that this becomes a battle that is not different from Dr. King's work and John Lewis's work and Amelia Boynton and Precious C.T. Vivian, all of those soldiers, all of those heroes, named and unnamed, who fought in Selma and amplified the need for voting rights for all Americans, created a new democracy, as I would like to say. They were, in some ways, people like C.T. Vivian and F.D. Reese. They were some of the founding fathers and mothers of this nation, as they created through their work in developing the 1965 Voting Rights Act a new America, a new democracy. So, Cliff, I want to encourage you to keep on. We're with you 1,000%. I'll chat with you offline in terms of how we make link into those phone banks so that we can get some people over the holiday season calling in and impressing upon our national leadership the importance of voting rights. You bring so much. You and Latasha Brown bring so much to the nation with the work that you do. Have you met with President Biden yet?
No, I haven't. We don't get those invites.
Well,
we've been giving them hell, so we don't get the secret meeting invite.
well, that's okay. We'll keep pushing because you don't have to be invited in some ways. You're making your voice known to the nation and known to those who all of us who seek justice. Cliff Albright, Politics and Grits. Thank you, Cliff, for coming on. Hopefully, we'll have you back on sometime in January after this bill is passed, and we can rejoice a little bit and then look for the next struggle ahead in terms of building our democracy. Cliff Albright, Black Voters Matters. You take care. All right, thank you. What an astounding individual. Contributing to our efforts to build democracy, not only in Boston, as he said, but in Baton Rouge, in Boise, in all those places across the nation where our right to vote rights to vote are being suppressed. We're going to have him back on. It's important that we pull in national voices into our Boston discussion. So even as we talk about the importance, the on-the-ground importance of policy making in the city of Boston, with our new mayor, with new people of color, black people coming into this new administration, how is it connected? We must ask the question. How is it connected to the national narrative in terms of black struggle, or the international narrative in terms of black struggle? Can we talk about the Freedom to Vote Act as a form of reparation? Let's think about that. Let's reflect on that. Can we think about the Right to Vote Act as a form of contributing to the building of our democracy locally? Let's think about that. There's something afoot, by the way, in terms of bringing back the local Boston School Committee. It's about elections and it's about democracy. How do we make these tie-ins, so to speak, between what's happening nationally amongst black folks and what's happening locally? We cannot afford to sit as an island, isolated. One of the things I hear as I move across the country, and we're about to sign off before our Christmas holiday on Saturday, one thing I hear often across the country is that blacks in Boston are so isolated from blacks across the country that there is no palpable connection. One of the things we want to do here at Politics and Grits is make that connection. Let's not be an island unto ourselves. Let's connect with people across the country. We can learn from each other that way. We can create the unity we need to create in Boston by looking how other black people and institutions across the country are creating unity, building towards a better future in terms of its culture, its social presence, its economic presence. That just reminds me to work ahead around Faneuil Hall We got to do that name change, but we also had a hearing this year. Julia Mejia has promised to revisit this hearing about around 143 businesses at Faneuil Hall, none of them black-owned. 143 businesses at Faneuil Hall. As we sign off before Christmas, we celebrate the birth of Christ, the advent of Christ. We celebrate Santa Claus, St. Nicholas. He was real. One of our saints within Christendom. Let's think about all these things and enjoy your time with your loved ones, those whom you love and those who love you this Saturday on Christmas. Have a great time. Reflect on the struggle that we've engaged over the years and the struggle that we will endure in this coming year. Our life, our efforts is about the struggle. Kevin Peterson signing off. Politics and Grits every Thursday morning live. Boston Praise Radio 102.9 FM. Have a great day. Merry Christmas, everyone.
WBPG LP 102.9 FM radio in Boston. We are located at 670 Washington Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts, zip code 02124. We are on this FM station from 2 a.m. to 9 a.m. Monday through Saturday and 2 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Sundays. Although we will be off of the FM signal until tomorrow, we will still be on the internet, television, and social media. Keep watching and listening to us throughout the day on www.bostonpraiseradio.tv, Roku TV, Apple TV, Shellcast Internet Radio, TuneIn Internet Radio, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, Audio Now, and 21 other media listening outlets. To WBPG LP 102.9 FM radio in Boston. We are located at 670 Washington Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts, zip code 02124. We are on this FM station from 2 a.m. to 9 a.m. Monday through Saturday and 2 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Sundays. Although we will be off of the FM signal until tomorrow, we will still be on the internet, television, and social media. Keep watching and listening to us throughout the day on www.bostonpraiseradio.tv, Roku TV, Apple TV, Shellcast Internet Radio, TuneIn Internet Radio, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, Audio Now, and 21 other media outlets.